Okay, everyone. Hello again. Um, Putting together our video lecture for this week. What is it here? Week 3. And all we have this week is another chapter by Hayakawa. Same book as we talked about in the last video on symbols. This is jumping ahead to chapter 9, chapter called How We Know What We Know. And so we're going to take the same kind of basic discussion of general semantics, premises, major assumptions, kind of familiar concepts and ways of thinking about the phenomenon of language in particular here. Keeping in mind, of course, this course is called Language and Thought. So we're kind of toggling back and forth between discussions about language and then also discussions about how we think about the world and how that affects how we communicate and vice versa. All right. So hopefully that whole serious man, rhetoric man stuff is still fresh in your minds, and those characterizations are still relevant, and hopefully that helped a bit, because I at least as I'm reading this stuff, I keep thinking back to that piece, and to me it helps orient all the readings, right? And so if it's, not clear yet, if I haven't made it clear yet, or if you'd forgotten, keeping in mind that as we're discovering this world of general semantics and what they were up to, this is the camp of the serious man, okay? Pretty soon, in the next couple of weeks, we'll be kind of transitioning out of that original context, and we'll be looking at historical developments that make the general semantics project really difficult. And that's when we'll start to kind of move more into the insights of rhetoric man. But for now, we're just trying to kind of get some of the basic coordinates down. And a lot of repetitive themes. I don't think of this early material as particularly challenging, but you got to be kind of thinking about it in a specific way, in that serious man way. So Hayakawa, just like Weinberg and just like Lee, is coming from this perspective of, wouldn't it be nice if we could think about language and if we could think about ourselves and our thought processes scientifically or as objectively as possible. And so it's worth keeping in mind the kind of the elements of this this kind of framework that we're working in, right? We've got the individual. We want to be thinking about individuals and their minds, individuals and their bodies and their sensations, and as Hayakawa talks about today, their nervous systems. And then there's the outside world, what Hayakawa called the extensional world last time, right? That kind of physical, objective, outside, external world that is real and, tangible and observable and knowable, and, one can get pretty good knowledge using, rigorous empirical analysis and testing and making sure we're doing our very best to accurately map and understand that external reality. That's, again, serious man and his assumptions. Then, of course, there's language, and language is how we mediate between ourselves and one another in this extensional world that we inhabit, right? And so, because language is a human invention, it is part of us, it is part of how we live, and we kind of code it with all of our, biases and errors and idiosyncrasies and so on, and impartialities. That's more of a rhetoric man insight. But the point is these are the kind of the elements of this phenomenon that we're looking at in this class, right? Language and thought. Individuals, the outside world, and then sort of language as the mediation between all that. And so what Hayakawa is up to in this chapter, How We Know What We Know, is he's looking at language, but he specifically wants to make a distinction between, I guess, what we would call concrete, specific, detailed, and precise language, right? Like black, thin, rectangular, device, digital device. You can get quite specific, shiny, right? Trying as best as possible to accurately convey some real phenomenon in our language so that we can, as we mediate our ideas about the real phenomenon, we are being as accurate and as clear and as easily understood as possible, because we want that correspondence chain of communication that we've talked about, right? And so it's very important to the general semantics that we think very clearly about the extensional world, the outside world, and then it's very important that we do our very best to organize our thoughts clearly and then organize our language clearly, and the chain continues, right? So what Hayakawa is doing here is he's talking about abstractions. And abstractions, obviously, these are ways of kind of broadening out our thoughts at the same time as we're kind of watering them down, right? And so like an abstraction allows us to kind of move up. Abstractions always seem to go up, right? We're moving up into the sky and getting bigger and broader. So Donovan Conley, individual specific thing, right? 6 feet tall. Don't worry about how much he weighs. 40, my goodness, 8 at this point. Canadian, cancer. I'm a cancer. I don't have cancer. I'm a cancer. So on and so on and so on, right? All that kind of descriptive thing. But then you can also go up and you can say like man, or you can say like Canadian, or you can say, professor, right? And so each time you're adding these kinds of names or titles or whatever, you're still helping kind of locate this individual, but you're doing that by kind of moving into broader and broader categories. And so my place within that category kind of gets watered down, right? Because man might mean many things. And if you take all the individuals that qualify as man and put them in the same categories, you're going to find a whole bunch of differences in terms of size and shape and ability and, knowledge and personality and all the rest of it, right? But nevertheless, it allows you, that abstracting process allows you to sort of convey ideas in an efficient sense. I put scare quotes there because efficient means that we can quickly understand, but we also lose a lot of the actual empirical reality of that thing that we are abstracting about, right? So there's a kind of a cost benefit like analysis that's necessary to conduct when we are abstracting, because as Hayakawa notes in a number of points there, abstractions are kind of unavoidable, and in many respects they're even good, right? So, poetry, religion, like a lot of abstraction, children's books, a lot of abstractions, big ideas that are kind of made simple by put in the form of an abstraction. And so it's like you can kind of feel what you're talking about, but you lose a lot of the particularities and the details. And that's the risk, right? And so there's an efficiency in terms of what we're talking about, but that efficiency comes at the cost of precision. So that's important to note. So Hayakawa starts off by talking about the extensional world, and he's getting really scientifically precise, right? So the general semanticists are hip to the notion that the world as such, the objective external world, is this constantly churning movement of activity down to the level of like atoms, molecules, electrons. Everything's just constant motion, right? And the closer you get to it, the less you're able to actually like grab it. And so that's a challenge, because we can get very, very specific about whatever it is we're talking about to the level of atoms and even beyond that, right? But at the same time, language is all about making communication more efficient, right? And so on the one hand, we want precision, but on the other hand, we need sort of to be pragmatic. Language is a very pragmatic way of kind of getting things done, but it has a lot of wiggle room and vagueness that's loaded into it. Nevertheless, he's talking about the external world, and then he's talking about our senses. He says in the second paragraph, middle there, our senses are extremely limited, so that we constantly have to use instruments such as microscopes, So just being within our bodies, living in the world, we have very, very, very limited access to the actualities of reality, right? We have our brains, we have our senses, but our senses are always hiccuping, they're partial, they're limited, right? And so we're getting always very kind of broken messages, interpretations about what's actually out there, right? Nevertheless, we communicate to each other as though we have confident knowledge, and errors multiply. That's the way the general semanticists would think about it. And one of the ways that we can try to improve that whole situation and reduce our errors and our vagueness and our confusion is by embracing this idea of abstraction and what we're doing, and ideally how to do it less or better, right? And so the process of abstracting on page 100 there, this little ladder, this abstraction ladder, is kind of interesting, right? And the idea is, like the example I gave a moment ago about myself, where you can start very specifically, like Bessie, that's the cow, that's the name of that one specific cow. But you can go up from Bessie to cow. Bessie, that individual, is member of, the group called cow. Cow is a member of the group called livestock. Livestock is a member of the group called farm assets. Farm assets are one kind of asset. And then finally, asset is part of wealth. Can you go above wealth? Economy, right? Global systems. All of that is layered on top of poor little Bessie there, right? And the thing about Bessie is that cows tend to look the same. Elephants, a lot of animals look the same, but that cow is not that other cow, right? Bessie 1 is not Bessie 2. Cow 1 is not cow 2. So general semanticists are very, kind of anal about this point of, the world is very, very particular and specific in its thisness, in its, the way things actually are, right? And so one black SUV is not the same as the other black SUV. And it behooves us, if we care about accuracy and avoiding confusion, to understand those distinctions. Now, they might be generally the same or much the same, but we get into ourselves into problems, these guys would say, when we conflate those two things as one thing, right? And yet we do this a lot. We make generalizations. We make big, broad statements about, broad phenomenon based on this one example or this one instance or this one person, or this person said that, so therefore I hate all those kinds of people, or this person did that and it was really lovely, so therefore those kinds of people are perfect and lovely, right? We abstract. Abstraction is another way of saying generalize. We make generalizations a lot. And I understand the impulse, and I understand the kind of the efficiency, but again, I find myself cringing a lot when I'm online reading stuff, social media type stuff. The amount of generalizations that are often made. Probably one of the most common ways of engaging and making observations on social media is to generalize. Here's an example of something, and now generalization, right? And then you should be asking yourself, how often does that example carry out across the general group that's being invoked? Very seldomly, I'd say. So in the process of abstracting on 100, the object of our experience then is not the thing in itself, but an interaction between our nervous system, our bodies, ourselves, our physical selves, with all their imperfections, and something outside them, right? So the general semanticists are, again, thinking about ourselves as physical objective entities with sensations and brains. And language is the thing that kind of connects us in a virtual sense. Language is sort of invisible, and yet it's palpable and important, but it's imperfect. And language basically operates as this abstracting kind of game, right? And so, as Hayakawa notes, even the business of definitions, which he gets into on 105-ish, even definitions, this is a pretty astute observation, even definitions, they're not defining things in a perfect sense. They're really just kind of describing how we use language to refer to things outside of ourselves, right? So even definitions, as seemingly precise as they might be, are still just kind of gestures and ways of attempting to reflect and represent the world as it is. But language is never able to actually do that, right? So the abstraction ladder, I think, is a good thing to be aware of in terms of like how it is that we can kind of move up and down. And as we move up, again, we're broadening out, we're getting more and more general, and our ideas, therefore, are getting more kind of vague, broad, kind of squishy and imprecise. And the more we kind of bring it down, the more accurate and precise we get. But again, if we were to deal with every single thing in its absolute particularity, we would just grind to a halt in terms of communication, because there's too much reality, there's too much precision to be accounted for. So the abstracting process within language helps us kind of speed through things, but again, at the cost oftentimes of accuracy and precision. Yeah, he notes by the way, just another reminder that these little guys are what I come up with and offer to you in lieu of PowerPoints. These are listed below the readings, and they have PR, or reading prompt, or RP in the title, just to let you know that this is the prompt or the reading prompt. So I hope you're making use of these things. They're just kind of like quick summaries of the key stuff in the reading. And number 4 there, he calls abstractions an indispensable convenience, right? So yes, abstractions allow us to cover a lot of ground in a hurry, but again, at an expense, at a cost. And the general semanticists are very concerned about that cost. So that's kind of it for this chapter. Let's see, dead level abstracting is this kind of final idea. Someone who's stuck at a high level of abstraction, and it only seems to kind of refer to an abstraction with other abstractions, right? So if you find yourself oftentimes invoking big, broad, vague, general kind of concepts and terms to try to convey your ideas, you might be a dead level abstractor, and you want to try to like get precise, right? When I say this, what am I actually referring to? And does it bear out, right? I think this is probably a good insight for us. It's sort of like, don't forget to floss, right? It's just a good reminder of like, try to bring it down as much as possible. Try to bring your ideas and your language down to a level of sort of empirical precision. Keeping in mind that is, in an absolute sense, is impossible, but we can get better at being descriptive. I care a lot about writing, and I've put a lot of effort into my writing, and I think that good writing is oftentimes very evocative and very descriptive, right? And that you can get a lot of really good work done in writing by offering really precise, but not exhaustive, but like relevant and precise and salient details. And I think there's an art to that. At the very end, he talks about when you get stuck at a high level of abstraction, and what do? And his basic final conclusion here on 111 is basically like, in that middle paragraph on 111 begins, the work of good novelists and poets also represents this constant interplay between higher and lower levels of abstraction. So he kind of bemoans the poets for being too abstract and too emotional and so on, while also acknowledging that poetic abstraction is a very common and even useful and welcome thing, but you need to be able to go back down to earth, right? So if you're talking about some kind of poetic turn of phrase, like the rosy-fingered dawn or whatever, like, what does that mean, and what is precise within that expression that is working here? I think that's the goal of the general semantics approach, which is go ahead and be abstract, but make sure that you're aware that you're doing that, and then be able to move down and get specific and concrete. And don't forget that actual on the ground reality is playing out, and we want to try to match up as best we can our abstractions and our free uses of language with the way things actually are. And there you go. And that's kind of the basic gist of this chapter, which is similar to the gist of the other chapters. Nothing too terribly challenging here. But, of course, if you do have any questions, by all means reach out. Just a couple more readings from the general semantics, and then we'll be dealing with our first assignment. We'll be posting that right away. So be on the lookout for that. And just a reminder, I've noticed that some of the view counts for the videos, the last lecture video, is pretty low. So I'm hoping that, you guys are checking in and making sure that we don't have much to do right now, right? It's just short little readings, videos, the reading prompts. Please do make sure that you are banging out each of those sets of content materials each week, because things will start to ramp up in a little bit in terms of sort of the reading load and the assignment load. So don't get caught behind this early. If you have any confusions, I'm happy to talk. Otherwise, we will continue and be looking out for that assignment. So have a good one, gang.